Hello, everybody. Welcome to Real Talk Radio. I'm your host, Hillary Raimo. Thanks so much for joining me right here on KCAA, where no listener is left behind. Well, I've been watching what's been going on in the world this past week, especially, and I have to say that I think one of the answers to all the trials and tribulations that we're watching play out on the collective stage has to do with consciousness. Consciousness, you say, well, how? Well, we're going to talk about that today, and we're going to explore what consciousness is, how it relates to our everyday life, whether you are a beginner in the understandings of consciousness or a seasoned expert. I think today you're going to learn something new to add to your toolbox of ways of dealing with the world and your relationship with it. I first met my guest, Tom Campbell, today. I met him I think about a decade ago, actually. I think I first met him around 2008. We were both cast members in the Path Afterlife documentary, and I had the privilege of sitting on a Q&A panel with him many years ago, and we traveled as the premieres opened up. We did a London premiere back in, I think, 2010. And so I met Tom in this unusual way, and I was introduced to his work this way. And I'm actually very glad and very honored that I had that opportunity to meet him that way, because I did get through his book. He has written a fantastic trilogy, about 700 to 800 pages long, so it might be something you want to settle into for a while. But I had the honor of reading that book as well, and I traveled to Lumley Castle to one of his intensive last winter in the northern UK, and was able to participate and be immersed into the understandings of what he teaches, which you'll find out this hour. So Tom began researching altered states of consciousness with Bob Monroe. And if you're not familiar with who Bob Monroe is, he was a founder of Monroe Laboratories in the early 1970s, where him and Tom and a few others were instrumental in getting Monroe's laboratory for the study of consciousness up and running. Hopefully he'll share a little bit of memories and stories from those days. These early drug-free consciousness pioneers helped design experiments, developed the technology for creating specific altered states, and were the main subjects of study all at the same time. Tom is known as the TC physicist in Bob's books, described in Bob's second book, Far Journeys. He also wrote a book, Journeys Out of the Body and the Ultimate Journey. So Bob's work was very instrumental to Tom's story. Tom has been a serious explorer of the frontiers of reality, mind, consciousness, and psychic phenomena for the last 40 years, guys. Using his acquired mastery of the out-of-body experience as a research tool, he has focused his work towards discovering the outer boundaries, the inner workings, and the causal dynamics of the larger reality system. And we're going to be talking about what that means this next hour. So the result of this research unites the worlds of objective and subjective experience under one scientific explanation. Can you believe that? Well, achieving the goal of generating one unified, comprehensive theory of everything, hence the title of his book, My Big Toe, that bridges metaphysics and physics with one scientific understanding. It sounds so simple, and we're going to figure out why it sounds so simple. He also has some current experiments he's been working under his newly formed nonprofit. We're going to be hearing some updates about that. And in general, just having a fun conversation about some things that might feel very serious and heavy to people. Tom has a wonderful way of bringing a lighthearted ease into understanding these often very complex topics. Another little bit of tidbit from his background. Tom earned his bachelor's degree in 1966, qualifying for majors in both mathematics and physics. And while an undergraduate, he became the president of his fraternity and chief justice of the college's student court. He was awarded a master's degree in physics from a Midwestern university in 1968. And his PhD work commenced with a specialization in experimental nuclear physics. His PhD thesis research explored excited states of the Na21 nucleus. I don't know what that means, but maybe he'll explain that a little bit more. Sounds very interesting, actually. He was an analyst with Army Technical Intelligence for a decade before moving into the research and development of technology supporting defensive missile systems, and he worked as a consultant for NASA within the ARES 1 program, assessing and solving problems of risk and vulnerability to ensure mission and crew survivability and success. So I am very excited, the station's very excited to have me here, and I know all of my listeners everywhere are very excited to hear what he has to say as well. So that's a long introduction to introduce my friend Tom Campbell. Thank you, Tom, so much for being here. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Hillary. It's my pleasure to be here.
Well, when I first thought about inviting you on, I said, well, he has so much to talk about and he's always going, and something new is always on the horizon. So why don't we start with where you're at right now, Tom, what you're working on, what makes you excited in the moment at this point?
Okay, well, I guess what's on the front burner right now would be a set of quantum mechanics experiments that I have created, thought up, and am now in the process of getting these experiments performed, getting them done. There's a group that's in Southern California, I guess where this radio broadcast is coming from, and it is working on these experiments right now. They've been doing the setup, gathering the equipment, putting it all together, testing it out, sort of thing. And I'm hoping that in a few months we will start having actual results. What makes these experiments interesting is that they will do a few things, give science some evidence that, one, this is a virtual reality that we live in, and two, some strong evidence that in this virtual reality, consciousness is the computer. So those are two kind of big things that if we have some scientific quantum mechanics experiments that demonstrate those two ideas, that should create a little bit of stir in the physics community. So we'll see. However they work out, I'm going to learn something. So I'm real pleased about it. I'm looking forward to it. This theory of mine, this my big toe theory, of course, is just a theory, and it needs verification through experimental science, and that's what these experiments are going to do. So they're going to either demonstrate or not the connection that my big toe theory, which is basically a theory of consciousness, how that theory of consciousness is able to describe physics, is able to derive relativity and quantum mechanics. So there's this connection between consciousness and the physical world. And here, that connection couldn't be any more direct than having the theory of consciousness derive physics in such a way that quantum mechanics is no longer weird science. It's perfectly logical science. It doesn't do things that nobody understands, but they're quite understandable from this viewpoint of virtual reality. So anyway, that's what's kind of on the front burner now for me, is getting these experiments done, getting the lab that's doing them up and running, if you will, to do these quantum mechanics experiments. Quantum mechanics experiments are not that simple. They're pretty simple as far as talking about them goes, but to actually set one up and do it in the lab is a bit tricky. So there's been a pretty long what we call a learning curve going on there, but I'm hoping that we're about at the end of it.
Well, I'm sure that you will accomplish it, especially after what you've done for Monroe Laboratories in the 1970s. So it takes a little bit of time. And, you're merging back, I think, spirituality and science. And at some point in our human history, they were separated. And I guess for good reason for some people, but for most people, merging the two back together, I think, is a very worthy cause, and kudos to you for taking that on. Let's start with what is consciousness for people who may be listening who have heard the word but don't really know too much about what it is, and for the seasoned ones who feel they perhaps do have a very good handle on what it is. How do you describe what consciousness is?
Okay, I have a very simple definition of consciousness, and that is it is awareness, okay, that makes choices. So it's an awareness. Now, when you say the word awareness, that brings a few things into play. One, that means it has input. It takes in data, it takes in information. It's aware of itself and its surroundings. So it has awareness and it makes choices. And that brings in the functions of, well, it has to have some processing in order to make those choices. And it has to have a sense of direction or a sense of purpose or mission. Otherwise, the choices would all be rather random if it didn't have anything to differentiate between a good choice or a bad choice. So all those things kind of pull into it, but you can simply say that by saying it's awareness that makes choices.
Consciousness is awareness that makes choices. Okay. I'm seeing that. I can feel that. I hope everybody listening can too. Now, you have a very broad and very interesting theory on how consciousness allows us to interact with what we would call reality, or what you call virtual reality. Explain to us what you mean by virtual reality and how that is in relationship with consciousness.
Okay. Well, um, even physics today is coming to the conclusion that our reality is information based. We had Newton tell us that our reality was materialistic. It was a big machine. They call it the clockwork universe. That was Newtonian vision. But since then, with relativity and quantum mechanics, we've realized that that is really not the case. So physics is making a turn right now, and I'd say that probably 20-30% of the physicists around the world probably agree that it looks like that our reality is information based. And that's just gaining steam. Over the last decade, it's gone from just a handful of scientists who thought that was a good idea to a pretty sizable and quickly growing minority who think that that is the way the world works now. So, in other words, from a Newtonian viewpoint, an electron is a chunk of mass with a unit charge. From a viewpoint of virtual reality, an electron is a point with the attributes of mass and charge. Now, those two things may not sound real different, but they're vastly different in the way you approach it. A point with the attributes of mass and charge is how someone would simulate an electron. It's just about information. So this idea that our reality is information is kind of the coming thing in physics. And that's where my big toe ended up, is understanding that this is a virtual reality. So an information-based reality is the same as a computed reality, which is the same as a simulation, which is the same as a virtual reality. All those things really refer to the same thing. Now, all virtual realities have certain characteristics. One of those characteristics is that the computer computing the virtual reality cannot be inside the virtual reality. The computer computing the virtual reality has to exist outside of the virtual reality frame. And from the perspective of inside that virtual reality frame, in other words, if you're an elf or a barbarian or a Sims character inside a virtual reality, from the perspective of that character, the computer computing that virtual reality has to be elsewhere, has to be non-physical to the experience inside the virtual reality. Okay. Now, the other thing that all virtual realities have in common is that they have players. There's a purpose for virtual reality. One doesn't just make a virtual reality with for no reason. And the reason making virtual reality is that players can log on to a virtual reality and play avatars, play the game, play characters. And also the player of the character, which is the thing that makes all the characters' choices. And by character, I mean the avatar inside the virtual reality. The player makes all the choices for that avatar. And the player, from the perspective inside the virtual reality, must also be non-physical, must also be, elsewhere. So the player and the computer are really the active components here. The virtual reality is just a computation, but you have a real player and a real computer, and those two are interacting with each other. The computer sends the player information. The player then makes choices for the character and sends those choices to the computer, which implements those choices on the screen in the virtual reality. And then the player sees those implementations and the consequences of the choices, and it makes new choices. And so we have a player and a computer communicating with each other, and those two then must be in the same reality, because both of them are non-physical to the virtual reality, and because they're communicating back and forth, they have to be in the same reality frame. Right? Now, what does the player and the computer have in common is that they're both part of information systems. Okay, they are communicating. That's the fundamental thing between these two entities, the player and the computer, is that they communicate. It's an information system, and they must be in the same reality frame since they're communicating with each other. So now that gives us just the basic logic of a virtual reality. Now, how does it apply to our reality? If this universe, as physicists are coming to understand, is a virtual reality, then that means that our bodies are the avatars, that our consciousness is the player, okay, making all the choices, and that our consciousness must exist in another reality frame that seems non-physical from the viewpoint of the avatar, and that there is a computer that is serving this game, computing this game, and that it is also part of the consciousness system, because the player and the computer have to be in the same reality frame. They have to be of kind of the same thing, if you will, sharing a reality. So that tells us that we, our bodies, our avatars, our consciousness is really us, and that exists non-physical to our physical universe, as does the system that is the computer, that makes up the computer. Now, I look at this as I talk about an entity called the larger consciousness system. And in that system, a part of it is configured as a computer, and a part of it is configured as us, as individuated units of consciousness that make up the players. So that's kind of what virtual reality has to do with the model and how that model applies to us. Now, it turns out that once you take this viewpoint that our reality is a virtual reality, all kinds of things start to become simpler. All sorts of paradoxes, things that we know are true because our experience and our experiments tell us they're true, but we just don't understand why they're true or why they're like that. All of these paradoxes, and there's dozens of them in physics and in neuroscience and biology, there's lots of these paradoxes hanging around, and all of these paradoxes resolve themselves. There's a simple, straightforward solution that clears up the paradox. And for example, it's the weird science of quantum mechanics, as seen from virtual reality, is no longer weird. It's a logical science, and you don't have to do the math to find out what the result is. You can just do the logic, and you can get there just as well. Relativity has some strangeness about it as well. The main paradox there is that the speed of light is a constant, always a constant. No matter how fast the light source is going, the speed of light is always the same, and nothing else in our universe works like that. So it's one of those paradoxes. And from the viewpoint of virtual reality, that is easily explained, as are other paradoxes, like where did that ball of plasma come from that initiated the Big Bang that started our physical reality? Well, scientists don't have any idea, because obviously it couldn't come from our physical reality, because our physical reality didn't exist yet. It had to had to predate our physical reality, and if our physical reality is all the reality that there is, then how could something predate our physical reality? So there's these paradoxes that hang around in physics, and again, from the virtual reality viewpoint, that's a very simple solution of where did that initial ball of plasma come from that initiated the Big Bang. So those sorts of things. In neuroscience, we have things about qualia. How does one get the understanding of qualia out of a machine like the brain? And it's the same idea is called in consciousness research. It's called the hard problem, which is how do you explain consciousness from a physical source, the brain, with the idea that the brain creates consciousness. And it's a hard problem because it'll never be solved, because it doesn't work that way. The brain doesn't create consciousness. The brain is a virtual brain, and just as the body is a virtual body. So
is the brain a computer, Tom? Is that what you mean by we need a computer? Is it the brain that you're referring to, or is it something else?
No. The computer is is in consciousness, and consciousness is non-physical. The brain is a virtual brain. It's a brain just like your Sims character has a brain, or the elf in World of Warcraft has a brain. It's just a simulation. It's an avatar. It's a virtual brain. It stores nothing. It computes nothing. It remembers nothing. All of that's done in consciousness. What the physical body does, what the avatar does, it sets the constraints according to the rule set that defines the virtual reality. It sets the constraints that tells, the system just what the avatar can do, what the avatar's limits are, what are its abilities and what are its limitations. So the brain will set certain limitations. So, for example, if you get hit in the head very, very hard, then you may lose your memory. You may, slur your speech and have other physical results of that being hit in the head. And that's because in this virtual reality, your avatar has just changed the constraints placed on the consciousness player. So now an avatar gets hit in the head, the consciousness who's making choices for that avatar has to work with an avatar that has now more constraints added to it. So that's the relationship between the physical and the non-physical here and the player. So no, the brain is not a computer. It really is just a virtual brain. Matter of fact, since this is a virtual reality, no brain need to ever be rendered unless somebody cuts open a skull or unless somebody's head, comes open for some reason. Then somebody needs to, the system needs to render a brain inside the skull. But it's just a virtual brain. So all that brain work that we think our brain does is really done in consciousness. The brain just represents the rule set within the virtual reality.
Now, would that describe disease? Certain people come down or diagnosed with diseases of the brain that have very real effects on the physical body and their ability to be able to do things. So would your description of what you just described fit for diseases that come into the brain and affects the physical body?
Sure. The diseases, anything that affects the physical body is part of the rule set. Now, I guess I have to define what is a rule set. Every virtual reality has to be defined by a rule set. What are the rules in the virtual reality? In our physical universe, that rule set is what we call physics, chemistry, biology, all the sciences. That's what science does. They dig out the rules in the rule set. In, say, the World of Warcraft, the rule set is different. there, characters can sometimes teleport and sometimes do other things. Lions can fly, that sort of thing. So the rule set will support different sorts of things. But in the World of Warcraft, if you fall in water and you don't know how to get your character to swim, then you'll drown, because that's what the rule set of World of Warcraft says. You stay underwater too long, then your character drowns, or your character falls off a cliff, he gets damaged, depending on what's at the bottom of that cliff. If it's hard rocks, then he gets more damage. So this is just the rule set. Our rule set that defines this is our physics, our biology, our chemistry. And yes, that disease exists here within the rule set. It's part of the possibilities within this rule set. Now, maybe I should go back to that Big Bang and kind of give your listeners an idea about this rule set. The origins of our universe is that it's a simulation, you see. So the origins start with a set of initial conditions, which is that ball of plasma with high temperatures and high pressures, and a rule set. And then, the run button is hit, and that ball of plasma begins to change according to the rules in the rule set, according to the physics of our universe. And as it does, it expands. As it expands, it cools. You end up with suns and planets and, solar systems like ours. Okay, and then cells develop, and then we have all the fauna and the people and the plants and the animals and everything then evolve out of that. So all that's evolved in a simulation. Okay, it's not computed. It's just our virtual reality that we live in is not a computed reality. It's an evolved reality. And it took a long time for the system to evolve that. It had to fiddle with the initial conditions and with the rule set until it got something that was stable, that would last long enough, would create a universe that would last long enough to evolve things that would be interesting for the players to log on to and play. So that's kind of where it comes from. And
well, I feel what you're saying. I can see it. And I think that our digital age, we've become, as a society, as a culture, even a global culture, we've become so enmeshed with digital life and devices and technology. And we have evolved so quickly, even within the last few decades. And we've adapted to being in relationship with devices and technology and information. Is the brain adapting to this as well? Could we even say that perhaps we now or within the next few decades even, that our brain will be working very much like a computer if it isn't already?
Well, everything adapts. This is a simulation, okay? So it's evolving. Our reality is evolving. Our consciousness is evolving. Nothing just stands still. Everything is in a process of change. So yes, we will adapt to our environment, and as we do that, some species will emerge, other species will become extinct, and humans will change. We are adaptable, and we are evolving. And when that brain evolves, all that does, it evolves the constraints on the player, on the consciousness player. So it may increase the constraints in some ways, and it may loosen the constraints in some ways. But that's what changes as far as we, the player, are concerned, is that the constraints change as the physical, what we call physical universe, evolves, and the things in it, like us, evolve. So yes, everything's going to change. Our attitudes have changed tremendously. And like you say, it's been over a very, very short period of time.
I don't think we've ever reached this period of time before. This is relatively new. So it's like a giant human experiment, really. And how can consciousness not be involved in that? When I look outside and I see, or I go outside and I see and feel the intelligence of nature, nature's evolving to environmental effects, whether we see it or not, whether we've protested enough or not, nature's still working every day, every minute of that day to evolve in its conditions. And so, whether us as humans do anything about it or not, it's still evolving with what it has. So, are we like that really as a species? I mean, we're still evolving no matter what we choose to do or not. Our biological presence in that virtual reality, is it adapting regardless of our decisions?
Sure, absolutely. It's going to adapt, um, period, to what it finds out there. Now, if we make decisions that creates a different environment, then it's going to evolve differently. So we're a co-creator in this, in that we have evolved to the point as human beings that we can modify our environments. We can change things here. And when we do that, we then have to evolve to deal with those things. So if we pollute the planet, then we're going to have to evolve ways to live with that pollution if we cannot clean it up. Some pollution lasts for a very long time, and we will have to evolve to deal with the things that we create as well as the things that are there. And we're in a very intricate balance. Us and everything else that's on this planet are all in a delicate balance with each other. It's all an interconnected ecosystem. As we make choices, it affects other things. As other things change, it affects us. So it is. It's a big, living, changing, evolving whole thing.
So there's no real way to get out of the connection that we exist in. I mean, people say, "Oh, I'm going to go spend some time alone." We're never really alone, are we? Now, you did a lot of work with Bob at the Monroe Institute in the 1970s, and I've always wanted to ask you this question. As many shows as we've done, I don't think we've ever really talked about this too much. When you were doing your consciousness experiments there, and you were traveling out of your body, and you were meeting non-physical entities, I'd like you to talk a little bit about that experience and what it meant for the change of your perspective as far as physical reality goes.
Okay, well, when I started working with Bob Monroe, that was like 1972, I would say, something like that. I was still a 20-something-year-old. And the arrangement that I had with Bob, and a friend of mine, Dennis Menerick, also started working with Bob at the same time. And the arrangement we had with him, that he would teach us how to experience the out-of-body state, and we would, you know, help him create this lab. He had built the lab, but he didn't really know what to do with it. So we would build equipment, we would create experiments, we would make sure the protocols were all good, and we would offer ourselves up as guinea pigs for these experiments. And that was sort of the trade. So Bob started to teach us how to experience, the larger reality, or go out of body is another way of saying that. And it didn't take us too long. Within probably a few months, we were able to do it somewhat. And within a few years, Dennis and I both could go out of body whenever we wanted and do pretty much whatever we wanted with it. Going out of body was something we did on demand. It became an easy thing. Now, that sounds maybe kind of like a big step to many of your listeners, but you have to understand that we spent about 15 to 20 hours with Bob Monroe every week for for years. So
Wow.
that's a lot of practice time. That wasn't just going to a seminar, once a year or something. That was almost every day.
Full-time job, Tom. It was a
Yeah,
full-time job.
it
Sounds.
was, yeah, it was about a halftime job,
Part-time.
20 hours a week. That was what we did. And we did that for probably 6 or 7 straight years, that halftime job. So that was a lot of effort and a lot of time put into it. But we were pretty quickly able to go out of body and explore this other reality system. And because I was the physicist, it was my job sort of to come up with the theory. How did it work? Why did it work that way? What could you do in that state? What couldn't you do? And why were there things you couldn't do? What was the point of it? What was its bigger significance? How did that out of body state relate to the physical world? What were the connections? So I was the theoretician because that's what physicists do. They try to model reality. Dennis was an electrical engineer, and he helped design and build a lot of the equipment. And we together, like I say, would spend hours and hours sitting in these isolation booths. They were acoustically isolated, and one of them was electromagnetically isolated. It was a Faraday cage. And we would spend many, many hours a week in those booths, learning to go in and out of these altered states, these out of body states. And then once you get good enough at it that you can duplicate a state in a situation very precisely, then you can start doing research there, which is what I did, being the scientist rather than the engineer. I started doing research. So I could go into an out-of-body state, do something that was evidential to the physical world, like remote viewing or healing or gathering data from databases about the physical reality, and then checking to see if the data I got out of the non-physical matched the data that was in the physical, things that were evidential. So I could do those things and then change a variable and then do them again and then change a variable and do it again and change a different variable. So just by changing variables and going there and repetition, seeing what affected what, I was able to then create a model eventually. Now I didn't do this in just a few years, but like 35 years later, I was able to create a model of consciousness, a model of reality, of how things worked. And I came across a set of facts that were not objective facts, but subjective facts, facts about consciousness. From doing this research in the out-of-body state. And one of those facts, one of the most obvious ones, is that consciousness is the superset and the physical is a subset. Or in other words, consciousness is fundamental, more fundamental than the physical universe. And that's because I could change variables within consciousness and it would change things in the physical reality. But it didn't work the other way. I didn't change things in the physical reality, which then would alter, the attributes of consciousness. It only worked from changes from consciousness to the physical. And that logically says that consciousness is fundamental, is primary, and the physical reality is a subset of consciousness. It's a secondary or a less fundamental thing. It's a product of consciousness. So that and a dozen or two other fundamental facts of consciousness that I learned, I took those and I took all the facts I knew about the physical reality. And being a physicist, I had a pretty complete list of facts that we know about the physical reality. Then I tried to come up with a model that would explain all of those facts on both sides, on the subjective side of consciousness and the objective side of typical physics. And that's what my books are about. It's this model of reality that models both the subjective world and the objective world. So it explains everything that is objective. It explains, it derives relativity and quantum mechanics, say, from one other higher understanding. And it also lets you understand, the science also lets you understand everything that is subjective. So if you'd like to know why you're unhappy, why life seems to be a struggle, or how to find peace and joy and those sorts of things, why your life is the way it is, why you are the way you are, your purpose here, and that sort of thing, then this will explain those things scientifically and logically, just like, you can explain things in the objective world. So that's kind of where my work with Bob Monroe gave me this access to the non-physical, if you will, to the more fundamental reality of consciousness to help me then do research and um, come up with a model of how the whole thing worked together. So I spent, I don't know, Dennis and I, like I say, we're probably about 7 years or so that we were doing this very intensively. And then we kind of slipped out the back when it became more trainers than actually research, because it got so popular. This idea that there were the sound, these binaural beats that could help put you into an altered state that was ideal for doing things like remote viewing or going out of body. That got so popular that we were kind of converted from researchers to trainers, just to help all the people that wanted to experience this and work with it. Other people came in then and took over our jobs, what we were doing, and Dennis and I kind of went off to live the rest of our life. I think by then we needed a break. We'd been working a half-time job and a full-time job for years, and that gets a little old after a while. So you have a job and a half going on all the time.
Well, it's interesting that your work opened up a category of interest and study into remote viewing. You know, our government is well known to have put a multi-million-dollar budget into studying remote viewing and psychic phenomena. So, which leads to my next question. Moving into the military world after part of this, when you were working for NASA, how was that for you as far as a transition goes? Was it easy for you to walk into the military mindset? For me, at least, when I think about it or look at it, it seems very closed down and not too open to some of the things that you were experiencing and learning at the time. Was that a difficult transition for you, or did your work with that actually help it?
Well, when I worked for DOD for many years. Matter of fact, that very first job that I took, where I met Dennis, and then Dennis and I met Bob Monroe, all of that started when we were both working in Army Technical Intelligence together. So that was a DOD job. So I worked within the Department of Defense for many years. At the end of my career in physics, one of my last things, I kind of quit the 9 to 5, and well, it never was 9 to 5, more like the 8 to 8, the 12-hour days. I got out of that and became a consultant. And then I started working for NASA as a consultant. But in any case, yes, I worked for the government, and I worked for military in the world of defense and in the world of intelligence. And mostly I just kept a low profile. I didn't discuss the things that I did, at work and with the people I work with. Now, the exception to that was that first job in technical intelligence, because it was my boss there in that job that introduced me to Bob's work and ended up making an arrangement for a whole 2 carloads of us from that technical intelligence center to go out and meet Bob Monroe out at his place, which then was called Whistlefield Farm. And it was only about a 45-minute drive from where we worked. So anyhow, so in that sense, my job with the military actually helped me get this career started as both a physicist and a consciousness researcher. Pretty much both of those careers of mine started at the same time.
Well, that's interesting. Well, do you base your new experiments on the experiments that you were doing back then, or are they new with different direction?
No, these new experiments that I'm doing are totally different. Back then, the experiments that we did at Bob's, when we were with Bob, most of the experimentation we did had to be evidential experiments. In other words, we had to know that what we were doing wasn't just stuff we were making up in our heads. We needed evidence. We needed to be able to read numbers on a blackboard that were put up on the blackboard after we were, shut up in our booths. We needed to know that we could get a headline that was going to be in the newspaper a week later. So we would look into the future probability database and come up with things that were likely to happen, predict their happening, and then wait and see if they indeed happened like that. We we did some healing work with our minds, a lot of remote viewing sort of things, going places, seeing things, then finding out if what we saw at those places was actually what was going on in those places. So that was all evidential work. And we pretty much limited ourselves to doing evidential things because, frankly, both Dennis and I were very hard cases as far as coming to the conclusion that what we were doing was real. You know, we were both techies, and we both were very difficult to drag into this idea that what was going on was indeed we were in some alternate reality and able to interact from that alternate reality with this reality. And that was hard. That was really a hard thing to accept. If you're a scientist, that's a very hard thing to accept. And it took both of us probably 3 or 4 years, even though we got good at going out of body and we had thousands of things we had done that were evidential, we still hadn't really gotten to that deep down in the gut point of understanding that it was real. You know, it's like, yeah, okay, it's really weird and we don't understand it, but, and that but would, you know, dot, 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 you know, it was really hard to get past that. And eventually we did. And for me, it was when Dennis and I went on an out of body adventure together. It was a fairly long trip. It was about an hour and a half to 2 hours long. And we saw lots of things. We had conversation while we were both out of body. We met above the lab and, I got out of our bodies, if you will. Now that's a not a very accurate way of saying it. You're not in your body. But we met above the lab, and then we went off and did things and saw people and had conversations. And then when we came back, and we were isolated. We couldn't hear each other or interact with each other in any way. We were in isolation booths, separated by a vacant. There were 3 isolation booths, and I was in the first one. Dennis was in the third one. And if either one of us had screamed, the other one would probably only heard a little muffled peep. They were very well acoustically isolated. And each of us had told Bob as we experienced this out-of-body experience what it was we were experiencing. So when that was over, Bob put both of our tapes that he had been recording what we were telling him, and he played both of these tapes starting exactly the same time, so they were synced in time. And there were Dennis and I having conversations with each other. We would be talking and answering each other's questions and seeing the same things and chatting about, you know, the various aspects of this adventure we were on. So at that point, and it was odd because intellectually I knew that it was real, but an intellectual knowing and a knowing at a deep level are 2 completely different things. And after that, I no longer asked, is it real? That just wasn't a question that was interesting anymore. But up until that point, I asked that every day. Is it real? What's really going on here? You know, it just
well, I think a lot of people can relate to that, Tom. You know, even today, when everybody's at a different point in their development or evolution of their spiritual maturity. So some people may have had lots of experiments and experience with doing this kind of thing, and some people are just being introduced to it. So what is real is still a question that's very relevant for a lot of seekers. And I find it even more fascinating that you were doing those experiments in the military, coming from a scientific background, because, you know, the 1960s came along and opened up a lot of consciousness for people. And the decade of love, you know, everybody coming in and opening up themselves. And even though there was a lot of drug use in those days, a lot of people refer to the 1960s as kind of a awakening or opening of consciousness for the collective because so many people participated. And then you go into the 1970s and there you are doing that kind of work, and the government and the military were getting into better understanding that work as well. That's very well documented. And they wanted to understand what this opening of consciousness was for people. But in your context of your theory, when you leave your body and you're experiencing these things and you can do it with other people, is this consciousness that's located kind of outside of the computer and out of the avatar, is it really just clear evidence and proof of your theory that this is exactly what happens because it's not located in the same reality? Do I have that correct? Am I saying that correctly?
Well, I would put it a little differently. And, I had these experiences and I was able to, repeat these experiences over and over and over again. So I really understood the details and what affected what. And then I made a model. So I came up with a model that would explain all of the experiences, would produce a underlying scientific logical explanation for all of the experiences, both from the what was in the non-physical, which is in consciousness, and what was in the physical, our physical universe. So I came up with a model. Now a model is just a model. It's a theory. It's you come up with something and said, well, if this is my model and it explains all of these facts on both sides, the objective and the subjective. That doesn't make the model perfect. It doesn't even make the model right. What makes a model a good model is whether or not it can logically and scientifically describe all the things that are going on in both realms, subjective and objective. If it can do that, then it's a good model. In other words, it has to be able to explain all the facts that we know. So a good model in the physical world is one that explains all the physical facts. There isn't any physical fact that it can explain logically, then that would be a very good model. And one that's a big toe like mine, just not a little toe of the physical world, but a big toe that's also the consciousness side, it has to explain all of those subjective facts and explain them well. So a model is only, we don't say the model is true or that the model is a law. We just say that the model, how good is it at explaining the facts on the board, the things that we know? And if it can explain everything, well, then it's an excellent model. If it can only explain some of the things, then it's obviously an incomplete model.
Or a little toe. It's a little toe. We are actually out of time. I'm sorry to cut you off. I want to let our listeners know, especially because right here on KCAA, we air in the Southern California areas. In just over 2 weeks, Tom will be presenting a 2-day My Big Toe event in Southern California at the University of California in Irvine, October 19th and 20th. And there are still tickets available. You can go to MBT Events, mybigtoeevents.com. You can find your way to not only that event, but some other events that Tom's doing. He does events all over the world. And sometimes they're a week long, and sometimes they're a shorter one like this one. So if you've liked what you've heard this last hour and it's piqued your curiosity, by all means, reach out for his book. Find his book anywhere.